Before I begin, if you've ever lived through a quiet kind of betrayal, the kind that doesn't shout but slowly erases you, please leave a comment, and subscribe to Voice of Legends. I raised my son with the belief that love shows up, even when it's inconvenient. His name is Daniel, and for most of his life, he showed up for me too. We were never a loud family, no dramatic dinners or grand gestures, just phone calls at the end of the day, shared jokes that didn't need explaining, and a comfort that came from knowing someone was always on the other end of the line. After his father passed, it became just the two of us in a quieter house. Daniel called every morning on his way to work. Even when he was running late, he'd say, "I'll call you tonight, Mom," and he always did. That's why the silence after his wedding felt so wrong. It wasn't sudden, like a door slammed shut. It was slow, like a light being dimmed one click at a time, until I realized I was sitting in the dark. The wedding itself was beautiful, I'll give it that. His wife, Clara, looked radiant, and Daniel's smile that day reminded me of the little boy who used to run toward me at the school gate. I remember standing there, watching them take their vows, feeling proud and strangely relieved. I thought, I've done my job. He's happy. He's loved. I didn't expect to become invisible. At first, I told myself it was normal. Newlyweds are busy. They travel. They learn each other's habits. They build a life. So when Daniel missed his usual morning call the week after the wedding, I smiled and made tea instead. When the second week passed and he only sent a short text, "Busy, Mom, talk soon," I nodded like I understood. By the third week, I started leaving my phone on the table again, screen up like it used to be. Old habits don't die easily. But the phone stayed dark. Clara was polite, always. That's something people don't understand when I try to explain this. She was never openly cruel. She never raised her voice or said anything sharp to my face. In some ways, that made it harder. She smiled when she spoke to me. She hugged me at family gatherings. She thanked me for gifts with carefully chosen words. But there was a distance in her eyes, like she was measuring something and finding it lacking. During the wedding planning, I noticed how often she spoke for Daniel. When I asked him about a date, she answered. When I asked about a song, she smiled and said, "We've already decided." I told myself I was being sensitive. I didn't want to be that mother, the one people whisper about. So I stayed quiet. After the wedding, I tried calling Daniel myself. The first time it rang until voicemail. I didn't leave a message. The second time he answered, but his voice sounded managed. That's the only word I can think of. He said he was in the middle of something, promised to call back, and didn't. When I finally did speak to him a week later, it was barely 5 minutes. Clara's voice floated in the background, reminding him of something, and he grew distracted, apologetic. I hung up feeling like I'd interrupted my own son's life. That was new. That feeling sat heavy in my chest. People around me had opinions. "He's married now," they said. "You need to give them space. This is healthy. It's not about you." I nodded along because I didn't want to argue, but deep down I knew something was different. Not changed, different. Daniel wasn't just busy, he was absent. There's a difference, and mothers feel it in their bones. The calls stopped completely after 3 months. No morning check-ins, no weekend updates, no casual, "Mom, you won't believe what happened today." When I sent a message, it was read hours later, sometimes not answered at all. On his birthday, I called, straight to voicemail. On mine, there was a card in the mail, signed by both of them, with neat handwriting that didn't look like his. The first time I cried about it, I felt ashamed. I sat alone at my kitchen table, holding my phone, and told myself to grow up. Children leave, that's life. But grief doesn't listen to logic. Grief listens to absence. I started replaying moments in my head, searching for the mistake I must have made. Did I say something wrong at the wedding? Did I cross a line without realizing it? I remembered a small moment at the reception, how Clara had stiffened when Daniel danced with me, how her smile had tightened. I remember brushing it off, telling myself I was imagining tension where there was none. Now that memory felt heavier. One afternoon, about 6 months after the wedding, I decided to visit them. I didn't announce it. I told myself it was a normal thing to do, that mothers visit their children. Their apartment was only 30 minutes away. I brought a small plant and a container of soup, like I always used to when Daniel was sick. When Clara opened the door, her surprise was carefully hidden, but I saw it. The apartment was lovely, tidy, impersonal. Daniel hugged me, but it felt rushed, like he was checking off a task. We sat in the living room, making small talk. I asked about work. Clara answered. I asked about their plans. Clara answered. Daniel stayed quiet, nodding, smiling, letting her speak. At one point, I asked him directly if everything was okay, if I'd done something to upset them. He looked at Clara before answering. That look told me more than his words ever could. He said, "No, Mom, everything's fine," but his eyes didn't meet mine. I left that day with a polite goodbye and a deep, unsettling certainty. My son hadn't stopped calling because he forgot me. He stopped because he was being asked to. Not demanded, asked, gently, persistently, framed as something reasonable. I could almost hear the words, boundaries, priorities, new family, words that sound healthy on the surface but can be sharpened into weapons if used without kindness. As I drove home, I realized this wasn't about a single argument or a clear villain. It was about influence, about quiet decisions made when I wasn't in the room, and the hardest truth settled in my chest like a stone. Daniel was choosing the path of least resistance, even if it led away from me. That night, I didn't call him, I didn't text. For the first time since he was born, I waited. Not because I didn't care, but because I needed to understand what I was dealing with. Love that disappears without explanation hurts more than anger. And somewhere in that waiting, I knew this story wasn't just about a son who stopped calling. It was about what happens when love is slowly edited out of someone's life, one quiet decision at a time. The waiting changed me in ways I didn't expect. Days passed, then weeks, and my phone stayed silent. At first, I checked it constantly, like a reflex I couldn't unlearn. Then slowly, the checking became less frantic. I began to notice how quiet my house had become, how time stretched differently when no one was filling it with their voice. I filled the silence with small routines, morning walks, longer grocery trips, rearranging drawers that didn't need rearranging, anything to avoid sitting still with my thoughts. But no matter how busy I made myself, my mind kept returning to the same questions. When did I stop being someone my son could talk to, and how did I miss the moment it happened? One evening, my sister called. She asked about Daniel casually, the way people do when they assume everything is fine. I hesitated before answering, and she heard it. She always could. I told her the truth in pieces, careful not to sound bitter. She listened quietly, then said something that stayed with me. She said, "Sometimes love doesn't disappear, it just gets managed by someone else." That word again, managed. It fit too well. I thought about the way Clara organized everything, the way she planned conversations before they happened, the way Daniel deferred without even realizing he was doing it. He wasn't being cruel, he was being compliant, and I knew my son well enough to understand why. He hated conflict, always had. As a child, he'd give up his favorite toy just to keep the peace. As a man, he was giving up phone calls, then visits, then pieces of his past because it was easier than arguing. I remembered the first time Clara and I disagreed, long before the wedding. It was about something small, almost laughable now. Daniel had invited me to join them for dinner one weekend. Clara smiled and said, "Oh, I thought we were keeping Sundays just for ourselves." Daniel looked between us, uncertain. I lofted it off and said, "Another time then." Clara thanked me for understanding. Daniel exhaled, relieved. That moment replayed itself in my mind with new clarity. It wasn't about Sunday dinner, it was about setting a pattern. And patterns, once set, are hard to break. Months later, I finally received a message from Daniel. It was short, polite, and felt strangely formal. He asked how I was doing. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. I wanted to say everything. I wanted to ask why he disappeared, why he let distance grow like a wall between us. But I also knew that unloading years of hurt into a text message would only push him further away. So I answered simply. I said I was okay. I asked about him. His reply came hours later. He said they were busy but doing well. No follow-up, no question back. I put the phone down and felt a quiet resignation settle over me. This was the rhythm now, uneven, controlled. I began to see the situation more clearly, not through anger, but through observation. Clara wasn't trying to hurt me directly. She was protecting what she believed was hers. In her mind, closeness to me was a threat to her marriage, to her control, to her sense of being first. And Daniel, instead of explaining that love isn't a competition, chose silence. He chose distance. And that choice hurt more than any argument ever could have. I wondered if he even realized what he was doing, or if, from his perspective, things were simply easier this way. No tension, no divided loyalties, just peace, even if it was built on absence. The hardest part were the memories. They came uninvited. Daniel at 8 years old calling me from a friend's house just to say goodnight. Daniel at 16 sitting at the kitchen counter telling me about his first heartbreak. Daniel at 25 calling to ask how long to cook pasta because he didn't trust the instructions on the box. Those memories felt like proof of something I had lost without being asked. I didn't blame Clara for wanting her husband's attention. I blamed Daniel for not finding room for both of us. Love doesn't shrink when you add more people, it expands, or at least it should. One afternoon, I ran into an old neighbor who asked about Daniel. When I said I hadn't seen him in a while, she frowned and said, "That's strange. He always talked about you." That sentence stayed with me all the way home. Always talked about you, past tense. It made me realize that in some quiet way, my son was editing me out of his story when I wasn't there to hear it. Not because he stopped loving me, but because loving me out loud became inconvenient. And that realization forced me to confront something uncomfortable. I had been waiting for him to come back to me, to fix this, without asking myself what I was willing to accept if he did. The next time Daniel called, it surprised me. His name lit up my phone, and my heart raced like it used to. I answered immediately. His voice sounded tired. He said he just wanted to check in. I could hear Clara in the background, moving around, making noise, reminding him of her presence without saying a word. I listened more than I spoke. I let him talk about work, about small frustrations, about nothing that really mattered. When there was a pause, I almost said it, almost asked the question that had been burning in me for a year. But I stopped myself. I realized something in that moment. If I forced the truth out of him before he was ready to face it, he would retreat again, and I wasn't sure I could survive another disappearance. So instead, I said something different. I told him I missed him, not accusingly, not dramatically, just honestly. There was a long silence on the other end, longer than any we'd shared before. Finally, he said, "I know, Mom." His voice cracked just enough for me to hear it. That crack told me everything I needed to know. He knew exactly what was happening. He just didn't know how to change it. After that call, I stopped waiting by the phone, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. I started building a life that didn't revolve around his availability. I joined a book club, I volunteered twice a week, I learned to enjoy evenings without the expectation of his voice. And in that space, something surprising happened. My sadness softened. It didn't disappear, but it became something I could carry instead of something that carried me. I realized that while my son had the power to hurt me, he no longer had the power to define my entire emotional world. Still, questions lingered. Would he ever choose differently? Would Clara ever loosen her grip? Or would this quiet distance become permanent, accepted as normal by everyone except me? I didn't know, but I did know this. Love that demands silence isn't healthy, no matter how politely it's enforced. And love that survives only by shrinking isn't love at all. It's surrender. And my son, whether he admitted it or not, was surrendering parts of himself to keep the peace. As I lay in bed one night, staring at the ceiling, I realized the truth I'd been avoiding. Knowing why my son stopped calling didn't hurt less. In some ways, it hurt more, because now I understood that the distance wasn't accidental. It was chosen, quietly, repeatedly. And that meant the next step in this story wouldn't be about waiting. It would be about deciding what I was willing to accept and whether silence was something I could live with or something I would finally have to challenge. The decision to stop waiting didn't come with a dramatic moment or a clear sense of victory. It came quietly, like most real decisions do, in the middle of an ordinary day. I was standing in the grocery store, staring at a shelf of soup cans, when I realized I no longer knew which one Daniel liked best. For years, I'd bought the same kind without thinking: chicken noodle, low sodium. It hit me then how much time had passed, how many small details had slipped away without a goodbye. That realization didn't break me, it steadied me. It told me something important. Distance doesn't just happen to us, we live inside it, and we adapt whether we want to or not. A few weeks later, Daniel invited me to dinner. The invitation came through Clara, sent as a neatly worded message that included the date, time, and address, as if I were a guest rather than his mother. I stared at the screen, weighing my response. Part of me wanted to say no, to protect myself from the awkwardness I knew would come. Another part of me wanted to go, not because I missed them, but because I needed clarity. I needed to see with my own eyes what my place in his life had become. So I said yes. The dinner was polite. That's the word that best describes it. Polite smiles, polite conversation, polite distance. Clara had prepared an impressive meal, and I thanked her sincerely. Daniel complimented her often, almost excessively, like he was reinforcing something for both of us. We talked about safe topics: work, weather, a show they were watching. No one mentioned the months of silence, the missed calls, the quiet grief that had lived with me for over a year. It was as if acknowledging it might crack the careful balance they'd built. I watched Daniel closely. He looked thinner, tired, not unhappy exactly, but contained, like someone always measuring his words before letting them out. At one point, Clara excused herself to the kitchen. The room went quiet. I felt the weight of the moment settle between us. This was it, I thought. If I didn't speak now, I never would. So I did something I hadn't done before. I told the truth, without blame. I told him that I missed him, that I felt like I'd lost my son without being told why, that I didn't want to compete or interfere, I just wanted to exist in his life again. My voice stayed calm, but my hands trembled. Daniel stared at the table, then finally looked up at me. His eyes were wet. He didn't deny anything, he didn't argue, he just said, "I didn't know how to balance it." That sentence broke my heart more than any accusation could have, because it meant he'd been carrying this weight alone, choosing silence instead of honesty, thinking that was the only way to keep everyone happy. Clara returned before he could say more. The moment closed, just like that. The rest of the evening passed in careful neutrality. When I left, Daniel hugged me longer than he had in months. It wasn't enough to fix things, but it was enough to tell me that something inside him was shifting. On the drive home, I didn't feel relief, I felt resolve. I realized that clarity doesn't always come with comfort. Sometimes it comes with responsibility. I couldn't force my son to choose differently, but I could choose how I responded to his choices. After that dinner, I changed my approach. I stopped initiating contact the way I used to, not as punishment, but as a boundary. I let Daniel reach out when he could, and when he did, I met him with warmth, not desperation. I didn't ask for more than he offered. I didn't fill silences with explanations. And slowly, something unexpected happened. He began calling a little more often. Not regularly, not like before, but with intention. The calls were shorter, but they felt more real, less managed. I could hear it in his voice when Clara wasn't around, a looseness, a familiar cadence I hadn't heard in a long time. One afternoon, he told me he felt torn. He didn't use those exact words, but it was there between the lines. He said marriage was harder than he expected, that he felt like he was always choosing something and someone else was always losing. I listened without offering solutions. This wasn't my moment to fix him. It was my moment to let him see that love doesn't demand erasure. I told him that I never wanted to be a burden, that my love didn't come with conditions, that he didn't owe me constant attention, but I did need honesty. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'm afraid of disappointing everyone." That sentence told me everything. My son wasn't cruel, he was scared, and fear, left unexamined, can do as much damage as malice. I also began to see Clara differently, not as a villain, but as someone deeply insecure in her place. She needed control because she didn't trust that she was enough without it. That didn't excuse her behavior, but it explained it. And understanding that helped me let go of some of my resentment. I didn't need to like her, I just needed to stop letting her define my relationship with my son. That realization gave me a strange sense of peace. The real turning point came on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Daniel called unexpectedly. He said he was alone. His voice sounded heavier than usual. He told me he'd had a long conversation with Clara, that he tried to explain what my absence felt like to him, that he didn't want to choose between us anymore. I didn't celebrate, I didn't push, I just listened. When he finished, he asked me a question that caught me off guard. He asked if I was angry with him. I told him the truth. I said I'd been hurt, that I'd been lonely, but that anger fades when people are willing to see what they've done. I told him forgiveness isn't a single moment, it's a process. He said he understood. I'm not sure he fully did, but he was trying, and trying matters. After that call, I cried, not from sadness, but from release. I realized I'd been holding my breath for a long time, waiting for acknowledgement, not reconciliation, not apology, just acknowledgement. And now that it had come, I could finally exhale. Things weren't magically fixed, they still aren't, but the silence is no longer complete, and more importantly, I no longer feel erased. I've learned something through all of this. Love doesn't disappear when children grow up. It changes shape, and sometimes it gets tested in ways we never expected. My son stopped calling after his wedding, and I knew why. But knowing why wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I had to learn that loving someone also means knowing when to step back, when to speak up, and when to let go of the version of the relationship you thought you'd always have. The story isn't finished yet. Life rarely wraps itself up neatly, but I found a quiet strength in accepting what is while still holding space for what could be. And that, I've realized, is a different kind of love, one that doesn't cling, doesn't compete, and doesn't disappear just because someone else tries to manage it.
Time has a way of revealing the truth.
Not all at once, but in fragments you slowly learn how to hold. After that conversation with Daniel, things didn't suddenly return to how they used to be. Anyone who tells you reconciliation is quick has never lived through real emotional distance. What changed was something quieter. The tension in his voice eased, the pauses between his calls shortened, and when he did reach out, it no longer felt like he was sneaking moments with me in between obligations. It felt intentional, as if he were finally choosing to be present instead of merely available. I noticed the change first in the way he spoke. He asked questions again, real ones. How was my health? What I'd been reading? Whether I was sleeping well? Small things, but they carried weight. Those questions told me he was thinking about me even when we weren't talking. For a long time, I had wondered if I still existed in his daily thoughts or only surfaced when guilt nudged him. Now, slowly, I felt myself being woven back into the fabric of his life, not as a habit, but as a person. Clara, however, remained distant. She was polite still, always polite, but politeness can be a wall just as easily as it can be a bridge. When Daniel mentioned me in conversation, I could hear her reactions even when she wasn't speaking. A pause, a change in tone, a subtle shift that told me my presence still made her uncomfortable. I decided then that I would stop trying to win her approval. I had spent too much time shrinking myself, softening my needs, hoping to be less threatening. That strategy had only led to erasure. Respect doesn't grow from self-denial. It grows from clarity. The real test came during the holidays. Daniel called one evening and asked if I'd like to come over for dinner. Not just a quick visit, dinner. He sounded nervous when he asked, like he was bracing for my reaction. I said yes without hesitation, but inside my heart raced. Holidays magnify everything. Joy, grief, resentment. I knew walking into their home on a holiday meant stepping into unresolved emotions, but I also knew avoiding it would only reinforce the distance we were trying to close. When I arrived, the apartment felt warmer than the last time I'd been there, not because of the decorations, but because Daniel seemed more at ease. He hugged me, properly this time, without rushing. Clara greeted me with the same careful smile. Dinner was quieter than most family gatherings, but it wasn't strained. Halfway through the meal, Daniel mentioned a childhood memory, a silly one about a school project we'd stayed up late finishing together. He laughed as he told it, looking at me, not at Clara. For the first time in a long while, he allowed a piece of his past to exist in the room without apology. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. That moment felt like a small victory, earned not through confrontation, but through patience and truth. Later that night, as I was getting ready to leave, Clara pulled me aside. Her voice was quiet, controlled. She said she hoped I understood how important it was for her and Daniel to build their own life. I looked at her and, for once, didn't soften my response. I told her I did understand, that I had never asked to be at the center of his life, only to be part of it. I told her love wasn't something you rationed or guarded like a scarce resource. It was something that grew when shared honestly. She didn't respond right away. Her eyes flickered, just for a second, and I realized she hadn't expected that answer. I wasn't asking for permission anymore. I was stating a truth. On the drive home, I felt lighter than I had in years, not because everything was resolved, but because I had finally stopped betraying myself in the hope of being loved. I had spent so long worrying about being seen as difficult, intrusive, or demanding that I'd forgotten I was allowed to have needs. That realization changed how I approached everything. I stopped apologizing for wanting connection. I stopped framing my presence as optional. And strangely, the more grounded I became, the more space Daniel seemed willing to make for me. There were setbacks, of course, days when calls were missed, weeks when things felt distant again. But now I didn't panic. I didn't spiral into self-blame. I reminded myself that relationships aren't measured by constant contact, but by mutual respect. And when something felt wrong, I addressed it calmly instead of swallowing it whole. Daniel noticed. He started doing the same. Our conversations deepened. He admitted that he'd been afraid of disappointing Clara by prioritizing me, afraid she'd see it as betrayal. I told him that love built on fear eventually collapses under its own weight. He listened, truly listened, and that told me he was growing, even if it was slower than I wished. One evening, he said something that surprised me. He said he was beginning to understand how much he'd lost by going silent, not just with me, but with himself. He said he felt disconnected from who he used to be, from the parts of his identity that existed before marriage. Hearing that was bittersweet. I never wanted his marriage to cost him his sense of self, but I was grateful he was recognizing it before the loss became permanent. I also learned to let go of certain expectations. I stopped waiting for an apology that might never come in the form I imagined. I stopped measuring progress against the past. Instead, I focused on the present version of our relationship, imperfect but real. And in doing that, I found a kind of peace I hadn't known I was missing. I realized that closure doesn't always come from someone else's actions. Sometimes it comes from your own acceptance. My son stopped calling after his wedding, and I knew why. But what I didn't know then was how much that silence would teach me about love, boundaries, and self-respect. I learned that being a good mother doesn't mean disappearing to make others comfortable. It means modeling honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. It means loving without control and refusing to be erased. And most of all, it means trusting that the values you tried to pass on will eventually find their way back, even if the path is longer than you hoped. As I sit here now, reflecting on all of this, I don't feel bitterness. I feel clarity. My relationship with my son is different, yes, but it's more honest than it's been in years. And whatever happens next, I know one thing for certain. I didn't lose him because I loved too much. I almost lost him because I stayed silent too long. And choosing to speak, calmly and truthfully, changed the direction of our story. Something shifted after that holiday dinner, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, but deeply enough that I felt it in my body. I slept better. I breathed easier. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't rehearsing conversations in my head before they happened. I wasn't bracing myself for disappointment every time my phone buzzed. I had reached a place where my worth was no longer tied to my son's availability, and that changed how I showed up in every interaction that followed. Daniel began stopping by occasionally, sometimes alone. The first time he did, unannounced, I nearly cried when I opened the door. He stood there awkwardly, hands in his pockets, looking like a teenager again. He said he was in the neighborhood and thought he'd say hello. That sentence meant more to me than he probably realized. It meant he thought of me without prompting. It meant I wasn't an obligation squeezed in between tasks. I was a place he wanted to be. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where he'd done homework and eaten cereal straight from the box. The conversation was easy at first, light. But underneath it, I sensed something heavier, like words waiting for permission. Eventually, he admitted he'd been feeling torn in ways he didn't know how to explain to Clara. He said she saw closeness to me as competition, even if she never said it outright. He said he tried to reassure her, but every attempt seemed to make her more anxious. I listened without interrupting. I didn't defend myself. I didn't criticize her. I simply asked him how it made him feel. He looked surprised by the question. Then he said something that stayed with me. He said it made him feel like a child again, afraid of making the wrong choice and disappointing someone he loved. That was the moment I realized how much pressure he'd been under. Not pressure I caused, but pressure he hadn't known how to manage. I told him something I should have said much earlier. I told him he didn't have to protect me by disappearing, that I was stronger than he thought, that what hurt wasn't his independence, but his silence. He nodded slowly, like the words were settling into a place that had been waiting for them. Clara and I remained cautious with each other. There were no dramatic confrontations, no sudden warmth, but there was a subtle shift. She stopped correcting Daniel when he mentioned me. She stopped steering conversations away from family. It wasn't acceptance exactly, but it was tolerance, and sometimes tolerance is the first step toward peace. I didn't push for more. I understood now that forcing closeness only creates resistance. What mattered was that my son no longer felt he had to choose invisibility as a solution. As the months passed, I noticed changes in myself, too. I no longer jumped to conclusions when plans changed. I no longer assumed the worst when days went by without contact. I had rebuilt a life that didn't revolve around waiting. Friends, interests, quiet joys that belonged solely to me. And because of that, when Daniel did reach out, I wasn't reaching back from a place of emptiness. I was meeting him from a place of fullness. That difference mattered. It shifted the balance. It allowed our relationship to breathe. One afternoon, Daniel told me Clara had asked why he seemed more relaxed lately. He said he told her the truth, that he felt better now that he wasn't carrying everything alone, that maintaining relationships didn't mean dividing loyalty. He didn't tell me how she responded, and I didn't ask. Some conversations are private, and respecting that was part of the boundary I'd learned to hold. But I could hear something new in his voice. Confidence. Not the loud kind, but the steady kind that comes from alignment. There were moments when old pain resurfaced, a missed call, a forgotten detail. I'd feel that familiar sting, that instinct to retreat or harden. But now I recognized it for what it was, a memory, not a current threat. Healing doesn't erase the past. It teaches you how to live alongside it without letting it dictate your present. And in those moments, I reminded myself of how far we'd come, of the conversations we were finally having, of the fact that silence no longer ruled our relationship. One evening, Daniel asked me a question that surprised me. He asked how I'd felt during the months he stopped calling, not defensively, genuinely. I took a breath before answering. I told him it felt like grief without a funeral, like losing someone who was still alive. I told him it made me question myself in ways I hadn't expected. He listened, really listened, without interrupting or explaining. When he finished, he said he was sorry. Just that. No excuses, no justifications. That apology didn't erase the past, but it softened it. It gave the pain somewhere to land. I realized then that this story wasn't about a villain or a hero. It was about people navigating fear, loyalty, and change without a map. It was about how easily love can be distorted when communication breaks down. And it was about how repair doesn't come from winning, but from understanding. My son stopped calling after his wedding, and I knew why. But what I know now is that knowing why is only useful if you're willing to decide what to do with that knowledge. I chose not to disappear. I chose not to compete. I chose not to demand. I chose to stand in my truth calmly and consistently. And in doing that, I taught my son something I hope he carries forward, that love doesn't require sacrifice of self to survive. It requires honesty, courage, and the willingness to sit with discomfort long enough for growth to happen. As I look ahead, I don't expect perfection. I don't expect daily calls or constant closeness. What I expect now is mutual respect, space without silence, connection without control. And whatever the future holds, I know I've reclaimed something important, not just my place in my son's life, but my place in my own. As the year turned, I found myself thinking less about what had been lost and more about what had been rebuilt. That shift didn't happen overnight. It crept in slowly in quiet moments when I realized I hadn't checked my phone in hours, or when I caught myself smiling at something Daniel said without immediately bracing for the next disappointment. Healing doesn't announce itself. It shows up subtly in the spaces where anxiety used to live. Daniel and I began developing a new rhythm, one that didn't rely on obligation. Sometimes he'd call on his drive home. Sometimes days would pass with no contact at all. But when we did talk, there was an ease I hadn't felt in years. He laughed more. He shared frustrations without filtering them. He asked for advice occasionally, not because he needed permission, but because he valued my perspective. That distinction mattered. It told me I was no longer a problem to be managed, but a person he trusted again. Clara remained on the edges of my life, and I accepted that. We weren't friends, and we probably never would be, but we were civil in a way that felt less forced than before. When we were in the same room, there was no longer that tight undercurrent of competition. I stopped watching her reactions, stopped measuring her tone. I realized that as long as my relationship with my son was grounded and honest, her feelings didn't have to dictate my behavior. That was her work to do, not mine. One afternoon, Daniel surprised me by asking if I'd like to join them for a short trip. Just a weekend, nothing elaborate. He said it casually, like it was no big deal, but I could hear the question underneath the invitation. Was I safe to include? Would this cause tension? I said yes, but I also made something clear. I told him I didn't want to be a source of stress, that if plans changed, it was okay to say so. He sounded relieved. That conversation set a tone that carried through the entire trip. We spent time together without forcing closeness. We shared meals, stories, quiet moments. I didn't try to reclaim the past. I stayed present, and in doing that, I felt something settle between us that had been missing for a long time. Trust. During that weekend, Daniel and I took a walk alone. The air was cool, the kind that clears your head. He told me he'd been thinking a lot about identity, about how easy it is to lose parts of yourself when you're trying to be a good partner. He admitted that in his effort to avoid conflict, he'd chosen avoidance instead, silence instead of conversation, distance instead of balance. Hearing him articulate that told me he was finally connecting the dots. Growth often looks like hindsight, painful but necessary. I told him something I hadn't said out loud before. I told him that watching him disappear had made me confront my own fear of being unnecessary, that as parents we prepare our children to leave, but we're rarely prepared for what it feels like when they leave without looking back. He stopped walking when I said that. He apologized again, more slowly this time, like he understood the weight of his words. I told him I didn't need endless apologies. I needed presence. And he nodded, like that made sense in a way it hadn't before. After that trip, our relationship continued to strengthen, not because we were closer in the traditional sense, but because we were clearer. We both knew where we stood, we both knew what mattered, and I stopped wondering what I'd done wrong. That question had haunted me for too long. I finally understood that his silence wasn't a reflection of my failure as a mother, it was a reflection of his struggle to navigate adulthood without the tools to manage competing emotional needs. I also became more honest with myself about my own patterns. I saw how quickly I'd minimized my feelings to keep the peace, how often I told myself I was asking for too much when I was really asking for basic connection. That awareness changed how I showed up in all my relationships, not just with my son. I spoke more openly, I set clearer boundaries, I stopped apologizing for existing, and the surprising thing was people responded better to that version of me. Respect tends to follow self-respect. There was a moment, months later, when Daniel didn't call for a while. Old habits stirred, that familiar ache tried to resurface. But instead of spiraling, I paused. I asked myself what was actually happening, not what I feared was happening. When he did call, he apologized for the gap and explained he'd been overwhelmed. I believed him, not because I needed to, but because he'd earned that trust back through consistency. That was another quiet milestone. I no longer needed constant reassurance. I had evidence. Looking back now, I can see how the silence after his wedding forced me into a reckoning I didn't know I needed. It stripped away assumptions, it exposed unspoken expectations, it pushed me to examine where I ended and where my role as a mother began. And in that examination, I found something solid, myself, not just as Daniel's mother, but as a whole person with needs, boundaries, and a life that mattered regardless of how often the phone rang. My son stopped calling after his wedding, and I knew why. But the deeper truth is that the silence didn't just test our relationship, it reshaped it. It taught us both that love doesn't survive on avoidance, it survives on courage. The courage to speak, the courage to listen, the courage to stay present even when it's uncomfortable, and most importantly, the courage to allow each other to change without disappearing. I don't know what the future holds. Relationships are living things. They evolve, they falter, they heal. What I do know is this. I am no longer afraid of silence. I understand it now. I know when it's a warning and when it's simply space. And because of that understanding, I no longer feel lost inside it. I stand on solid ground, connected but not dependent, loving without fear of erasure. And that, I've learned, is what real closure feels like. Not an ending, but a beginning built on truth. There is a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can survive what once felt unbearable. I didn't realize I had reached that place until one ordinary morning when I woke up and my first thought wasn't about whether Daniel would call. I made my coffee, opened the curtains, and let the day begin without that familiar knot in my chest. That was when I understood something important had changed. I was no longer living in anticipation or fear. I was living in the present, and that present felt steady. Daniel and I had settled into something that felt honest, not perfect, not constant, but real. He called when he wanted to share something, not because he felt guilty. He visited when it made sense, not because it was expected. And when we talked, we spoke like two adults who cared for each other, not like a mother clinging to a son or a son trying to manage a mother's feelings. That balance took time to build, and it required both of us to let go of old roles that no longer fit. One day, during a quiet conversation, Daniel admitted something that surprised me. He said that for a long time after his wedding, he'd convinced himself that distancing from me was the mature thing to do. He thought adulthood meant detachment, independence meant silence. He said he'd been afraid that if he didn't draw hard lines, his marriage would suffer. Hearing that, I felt a mix of sadness and understanding. No one teaches our children how to balance love. We teach them how to succeed, how to be polite, how to be strong, but we rarely teach them how to hold multiple relationships without feeling like they're betraying someone. I told him that maturity isn't about cutting people off. It's about integrating your life honestly, about letting the people who shaped you remain part of you, even as you build something new. He listened, not like a son being instructed, but like a man reconsidering something he'd long accepted as true. Those are the moments that matter, the ones where understanding quietly replaces fear. Clara and I had one final conversation that clarified everything for me. It wasn't planned. It happened spontaneously during a moment when Daniel stepped away to take a call. She looked at me and said she'd never intended to push me out. She said she'd felt overwhelmed by how close Daniel and I were, that she worried there wouldn't be enough room for her. I believed her. Fear makes people do things they don't fully understand. I told her something simple, that love doesn't divide the way fear tells us it will, that there was room for all of us if we allowed it. She didn't suddenly warm to me, but she nodded. Sometimes acknowledgement is the most you're going to get, and sometimes it's enough. As the months passed, I noticed how differently I spoke about my son. There was no bitterness in my words anymore, no quiet apology when I mentioned him. I wasn't protecting myself from disappointment because I wasn't building my happiness around his choices anymore. I had reclaimed my own life, my own sense of purpose, and because of that, I could love him freely without expectation or loss of love. I began sharing my story with others carefully when it felt appropriate. I was surprised by how many people nodded in recognition, how many parents whispered that they too had felt erased after their child married or moved on. There is a particular kind of grief that comes with being needed less, especially when it happens abruptly and without explanation. But there is also a quiet power in realizing that being needed is not the same as being loved. Love can exist without dependency, and sometimes it's stronger that way. Looking back, I see now that the silence after Daniel's wedding forced both of us to grow in ways we might have avoided otherwise. It stripped away assumptions, it revealed fears, it demanded honesty. And while I wouldn't wish that pain on anyone, I can acknowledge what it taught me. It taught me that my worth does not diminish when my role changes. It taught me that love should never require self-erasure, and it taught me that speaking your truth calmly is more powerful than staying silent out of fear. My son stopped calling after his wedding, and I knew why. But the deeper lesson wasn't about him and his marriage, it was about me, about learning to stand firmly in who I am, regardless of how often someone else shows up, about understanding that love doesn't disappear just because it looks different. It adapts, it matures, and sometimes it returns stronger because it was tested. Now, when my phone rings and it's Daniel, I smile, not because I need the call, but because I enjoy it. And when it doesn't ring, I don't feel abandoned. I feel at peace. I know where I stand, I know who I am, and that knowledge is something no silence can take away. This story doesn't end with a perfect resolution or a neatly tied bow. Life rarely offers that. But it does end with clarity, with acceptance, with a love that is no longer fragile. And that, to me, is the most honest ending there is. Would you like me to continue to Part 8 with 1,300 words? Continue. Part 8. With clarity came a different way of seeing my past, not as a series of mistakes, but as a path that led me here. I began to reflect on the years before Daniel's wedding, on how naturally our closeness had formed, and how easily I'd assumed it would always stay the same. No one warns you that love can change shape overnight, that the same bond that once felt unbreakable can suddenly feel fragile, not because it was weak, but because it was being stretched in ways you never anticipated. I started noticing how often parents, especially mothers, are expected to disappear quietly when their children form new families. We're told it's maturity, that stepping back is the loving thing to do. But no one explains the difference between stepping back and being pushed aside, between giving space and being erased. That distinction matters, and learning it changed how I spoke up for myself, not just with Daniel, but in every part of my life. There was a moment, months later, when Daniel called me late at night. His voice was low, thoughtful. He said he'd been thinking about how things unfolded after my son's wedding and how unprepared he'd been for the emotional shift. He admitted he'd assumed love was something you rationed, that giving more to one person meant taking it away from another. Hearing that told me he'd finally understood the core mistake. Love doesn't work like that. Fear does, control does, but love expands when it's allowed to breathe. He asked me how I knew something was wrong so early on. I told him the truth. I said a mother knows not because she's possessive, but because she's attuned. Silence has a texture when it's unnatural. It feels different in your body. He went quiet for a moment, then said he wished he'd trusted that instead of trying to manage everyone's feelings. That was a hard thing for him to admit, and I respected him for it. Growth often begins with regret. Our conversations became deeper after that. We talked about expectations, about fear, about how easy it is to avoid discomfort instead of facing it. I didn't lecture him. I didn't need to. He was discovering these truths on his own now, and that made them stick. I could hear it in the way he spoke to me, the way he no longer sounded defensive or cautious. He sounded grounded. Clara remained part of the picture, of course, and while we were never close, there was less tension. I sensed she felt more secure now that Daniel wasn't hiding parts of himself. When people stop sneaking, suspicion often fades. We exchanged pleasantries without strain. Occasionally, she even asked my opinion on something small. I didn't read too much into it. I didn't need validation from her anymore, but I appreciated the shift for what it was, a sign that honesty had softened the edges. I also began to understand something else. My silence during those early months had unintentionally taught Daniel that my needs were negotiable, that my presence was optional. It wasn't that he didn't care, it was that I'd trained him, without meaning to believe I would always adjust. Speaking up later wasn't about correcting him as much as it was about correcting myself, about modeling the kind of relationship I wanted him to carry forward into his own life. One afternoon, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by memories that no longer hurt the way they used to. Photos on the wall, old birthday cards, little reminders of a life lived fully. I realized I no longer felt the urge to rewrite the past. I didn't need to imagine different outcomes. The pain had done its work. It had taught me resilience, it had taught me boundaries, and most importantly, it had taught me compassion for myself and for my son. My son stopped calling after his wedding, and I knew why, but the deeper lesson wasn't about him and his marriage, it was about me, about learning to stand firmly in who I am, regardless of how often someone else shows up. About understanding that love doesn't disappear just because it looks different. It adapts, it matures, and sometimes it returns stronger because it was tested. Now, when my phone rings and it's Daniel, I smile, not because I need the call, but because I enjoy it. And when it doesn't ring, I don't. There is a moment in every long emotional journey when you realize you're no longer walking just to reach an outcome. You're walking because the ground beneath you finally feels solid. That's where I found myself as the years settled into something quieter and more dependable. The story of my son's silence no longer sat at the center of my identity. It had become part of me, not something that defined me. Daniel and I didn't return to daily calls, and I didn't want us to. What we had now felt intentional. When he called, he was present. When we spent time together, it wasn't rushed or obligatory. There was no unspoken tension, no careful editing of ourselves. We laughed more easily. We disagreed without fear. And when misunderstandings came up, we talked about them instead of retreating into quiet resentment. That alone felt like a miracle compared to where we had been. One afternoon, while sitting together on my porch, Daniel said something that stayed with me. He said he admired how I handled the distance, how I didn't lash out or disappear myself. I smiled when he said it, but later, alone, I thought about how close I had come to doing exactly that. Strength doesn't always look like composure. Sometimes it looks like staying when it would be easier to pull away. Sometimes it looks like choosing honesty when silence feels safer. I hadn't always gotten it right, but I had stayed open, and that mattered. Clara, too, had changed in small but noticeable ways. She no longer spoke about boundaries as if they were walls. She seemed more relaxed, more confident in her place. I understood now that insecurity often hides behind control. When Daniel stopped managing everyone else's feelings and started living authentically, the tension that fed that insecurity began to fade. We didn't need to be close for peace to exist. Mutual respect was enough. I thought often about other parents who might be living through similar silence, sitting with unanswered calls and unanswered questions. I wished I could tell them what I know now, that the absence you feel doesn't mean you failed, that your love didn't suddenly become a burden. Sometimes it simply collided with someone else's fear, and fear, when left unexamined, can reshape relationships in painful ways. If I could speak to my younger self, the woman who sat staring at her phone wondering what she'd done wrong, I would tell her this: don't disappear to make others comfortable. Speak gently, but speak honestly. Your feelings are not an inconvenience, they are information. Ignoring them doesn't make you noble, it makes you invisible. My son stopped calling after his wedding, and I knew why, but the deeper truth is that silence became the catalyst for something necessary. It forced me to reclaim my voice, it forced my son to confront his fears, and it forced all of us to redefine love in a way that could actually last. Not the kind of love that clings or controls, but the kind that stands firm without demanding sacrifice of self. Now, when I think about the future, I don't feel anxious. I feel open. Whatever role I have in Daniel's life will be built on honesty, not obligation. And whatever distance exists will be space, not abandonment. I trust myself now. I trust my resilience. And I trust that love, when it's real, finds its way back when people are brave enough to face the truth. This chapter is nearly complete, not because it ended perfectly, but because it ended honestly. And sometimes that's the most meaningful resolution of all. Would you like me to continue to part 11 with 1,300 words? Continue. Part 11. By the time this story reaches its final chapter, I've learned that love is not a straight path. It is jagged, unpredictable, and often tests every bit of patience, courage, and trust you have. The silence that followed Daniel's wedding was not a punishment, it was a mirror reflecting our unspoken fears, our misunderstandings, and the ways we unconsciously tried to protect ourselves. For a long time, I couldn't see past the hurt. I couldn't understand how someone I raised could vanish so suddenly from my life. But now I see clearly. It wasn't vanishing, it was transformation. And transformation, as uncomfortable as it is necessary for growth. The last year has been the most enlightening. Daniel and I have developed a rhythm that works. We don't need to speak every day to maintain connection. Instead, every conversation feels intentional, grounded in presence rather than obligation. When he shares something personal, I listen deeply. When I share my thoughts, he listens. Our interactions are no longer weighed down by unspoken expectations. That balance, I've realized, is rare and precious. It doesn't erase the past, but it allows the present to breathe freely. I've also learned the importance of setting boundaries without guilt. Early on, I feared that standing firm would push him further away. I feared that asserting my needs would make me seem selfish or demanding. But over time, I discovered that clarity fosters connection. When I no longer tried to shrink myself to fit into the life others were managing, I became fully visible, not just to Daniel, but to myself. And that visibility invited him back in, not because he felt forced, but because he wanted to be there. Clara and I have reached an understanding that is quiet but real. There are no long conversations or sudden bonds, but civility has replaced tension. I no longer compete for Daniel's attention, I simply exist alongside him, fully present, fully aware that my love doesn't need validation from her to matter. That realization has been liberating. Love is not a zero-sum game. There is room for everyone if the center of that love is truth and respect. I thought often about other parents who might be living through similar silence, sitting with unanswered calls and unanswered questions. I wished I could tell them what I know now, that the absence you feel doesn't mean you failed, that your love didn't suddenly become a burden. Sometimes it simply collided with someone else's fear, and fear, when left unexamined, can reshape relationships in painful ways. If I could speak to my younger self, the woman who sat staring at her phone wondering what she'd done wrong, I would tell her this: don't disappear to make others comfortable. Speak gently, but speak honestly. Your feelings are not an inconvenience, they are information. Ignoring them doesn't make you noble, it makes you invisible. My son stopped calling after his wedding, and I knew why, but the deeper truth is that silence became the catalyst for something necessary. It forced me to reclaim my voice, it forced my son to confront his fears, and it forced all of us to redefine love in a way that could actually last. Not the kind of love that clings or controls, but the kind that stands firm without demanding sacrifice of self. Now, when I think about the future, I don't feel anxious. I feel open. Whatever role I have in Daniel's life will be built on honesty, not obligation. And whatever distance exists will be space, not abandonment. I trust myself now. I trust my resilience. And I trust that love, when it's real, finds its way back when people are brave enough to face the truth. This chapter is nearly complete, not because it ended perfectly, but because it ended honestly. And sometimes that's the most meaningful resolution of all. Would you like me to continue to part 11 with 1,300 words?